Every other traitor in this series had to be found. The hunt was the whole story. The years of blindness, the wife with the secret, the voice on the tape, the defector's clue. Oleg Penkovsky is the opposite case, and that is what makes him the strangest spy of the Cold War. Nobody had to find him. He came looking for them. He chased the Americans through the streets of Moscow, pressing his secrets into their hands, practically begging them to let him betray his own country. And for the better part of a year, his own country's enemy did not want what he was offering because they could not believe it was real. When they finally believed him, he gave them more than any spy had ever given before. More than 5,000 photographs of the Soviet Union's deepest military secrets, the technical heart of its missile program, the truth about how weak the Red Army's nuclear arsenal really was. And then, in 13 days in October of 1962, when the world stood closer to nuclear war than it has ever stood before or since, the secrets one Soviet colonel had photographed with a tiny camera became the thing that let an American president see clearly enough to step back from the edge. He was a colonel of Soviet military intelligence. His code name to the Americans was Hero, and he is, by a strong argument, the most valuable spy the West ever ran. The man who saved the world and was shot in a cellar for it. This is the story of Oleg Penkovsky. Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky was born in 1919 into the wreckage of one empire and the birth pangs of another. He was born with a stain that the Soviet system never let him wash out. His father had been an officer in the White Army, the anti-Bolshevik force that fought the Reds in the Civil War, and his father had died fighting against the very state that Oleg would grow up to serve. In the Soviet Union, a man's biography was his fate, and a white officer's son carried a permanent shadow on his file, a question mark that no amount of loyalty could ever fully erase. And yet Penkovsky rose. He was intelligent, ambitious, charming when he needed to be, ruthless when he could afford it. He served as an artillery officer in the Second World War, was decorated, married well. His father-in-law was a Soviet general, and after the war he was brought into the GRU, the Military Intelligence Service, the rival and counterpart of the KGB. He trained as an intelligence officer. He served abroad. He reached the rank of colonel and stood on the threshold of becoming a general. And then the shadow caught him. When the system ran its periodic deep checks, the old stain surfaced in the White Army father, the unreliable biography, and Penkovsky's career stalled at the worst possible moment. The promotion to general did not come. A foreign posting he wanted was blocked. A man who believed himself destined for the top found himself frozen just below it, passed over, quietly distrusted, watching lesser men advance. For a man of Penkovsky's pride, it was unbearable. By the late 1950s, he was working undercover at the State Committee for Scientific Research in Moscow, a body that managed Soviet dealings with foreign scientists and businessmen, that hosted Western delegations and sent Soviet ones abroad. It was a perfect platform for an intelligence officer. It gave Penkovsky access to secrets, contact with foreigners, and reasons to travel to the West. And it placed him, a bitter and ambitious man, exactly where he needed to be to do the thing he had begun to contemplate, to take everything he knew and hand it to the other side. His motives have been argued over ever since. Resentment, certainly. The career the system had stolen from him over a dead father he barely remembered. Ego, without question. Penkovsky wanted to be important, to matter, to be a hero on a stage bigger than the one Moscow would give him. But there was something else, too. Something that the men who later debriefed him came to believe was genuine. Penkovsky was afraid. He had seen the inside of the Soviet military machine, and he had seen Nikita Khrushchev, impulsive, boastful, rattling nuclear weapons like a man who did not understand they could go off. Penkovsky came to believe that Khrushchev might actually start a war that would destroy the world, and that the only way to prevent it was to make sure the West knew the truth, knew how the Soviet arsenal really worked, knew how weak it really was, knew when Khrushchev was bluffing. He decided to become the West's eyes inside the Kremlin's war machine. The problem was getting the West to look. In the summer of 1960, on a bridge over the Moscow River, the Bolshoi-Moskvoretsky Bridge, In the shadow of the Kremlin, Penkovsky approached two young American tourists. They were students. He spoke to them quietly, urgently, and pressed on them a thick sealed package. He asked them to carry it to the American embassy to put it into the hands of someone in authority. Inside was an offer, a serving GRU colonel volunteering to spy for the United States, laying out who he was and what he could provide. It was the intelligence windfall of a generation, and the United States very nearly threw it in the trash. Because the American embassy in Moscow, when the package reached it, was afraid. The Cold War was a hall of mirrors, and the CIA's Soviet operations had been burned before by provocations. False volunteers dangled by the KGB to lure American officers into traps, to expose them, to humiliate the United States in a propaganda spectacle. A GRU colonel simply appearing, offering everything was exactly what a provocation would look like. The embassy hesitated. It worried about an incident. The package and its extraordinary offer sat, and the man who had risked his life to send it heard nothing back. Penkovsky did not give up. This is the detail that separates him from every cautious, fearful trader in the trade. He kept pushing. He tried again. He worked other channels, looked for other foreigners, refused to accept that the West would let a gift like this slip away. And eventually, the message got through to people who understood what they were being offered and who solved the problem of how to safely make contact in a city where every American official was watched around the clock by the KGB. The CIA turned to its British partners in MI6, and together they found the answer in an unlikely man, Greville Wynne, a British businessman, a salesman of industrial equipment who traveled legitimately to Moscow and Eastern Europe, arranging trade delegations. Wynne had the perfect cover because it was not a cover at all. He really was a businessman with real reasons to meet Soviet officials at the State Committee for Scientific Research, real reasons to host them and be hosted by them. MI6 recruited Wynne as a courier and a contact, the human bridge between Penkovsky in Moscow and the intelligence officers in the West. An ordinary salesman became the lifeline of the most important espionage operation of the Cold War. In April of 1961, Oleg Penkovsky came to London. He came officially, leading a Soviet trade delegation, a colonel doing his cover job, escorting Soviet technical men around British industry. But in the evenings, after the official functions, Penkovsky slipped away to a room in a London hotel, and there, for the first time, he met the men who would run him. It was a joint team, CIA and MI6 together. A Russian-speaking American case officer named George Kissevalter, who could talk to Penkovsky in his own language and put him at ease. Another American, Joe Bulick. And the British officers led by Harold Shergold. Night after night, they sat with him, and Penkovsky talked. What poured out of him in those London debriefings and in further meetings in Paris later that year staggered the men taking it down. He did not just answer questions. He lectured for hours, deep into the night, emptying out everything he knew about the Soviet military and intelligence apparatus. He explained the structure of the GRU and the KGB. He named Soviet intelligence officers operating in the West. He described the inner workings of Soviet missile development, the rocket forces, the doctrine, the personalities, the rivalries at the top, and he laid out, with the authority of a man who had seen the real figures, the single most important truth of the early 1960s, that the Soviet Union's intercontinental missile force was far smaller, far less ready, and far less reliable than the West feared. This mattered more than almost anything else, he said, because in 1960 and 1961, American politics was gripped by the idea of a missile gap, a belief that the Soviets had raced ahead and now possessed a terrifying lead in nuclear missiles. It was the kind of fear that could start a war, that could push leaders toward reckless preemption. Penkovsky's intelligence helped demolish it. He showed that the gap, insofar as it existed, ran the other way, that Khrushchev was bluffing with a far weaker hand than he pretended. For an American president trying to judge how much to fear Soviet threats, there was hardly any piece of knowledge on Earth more valuable. He was given the code name Hero by the Americans, Yoga by the British. The intelligence he produced was so sensitive that it circulated under its own protective code names. Ironbark for the hard documentary material, Chickadee for his personal observations and analysis, distributed to only a tiny circle of the most senior officials, so closely held that many of the people reading it never knew it all came from a single man. And Penkovsky wanted more than to inform. He wanted to act. He pressed his handlers with schemes that frightened them. At one point, by some accounts, proposing that he could plant small nuclear devices around Moscow ready to be detonated. The men running him had to manage not just an agent, but an agent's dangerous ambition to keep this brilliant, reckless, hungry man focused on the quiet work of photographing documents, rather than the apocalyptic fantasies of a would-be hero. Because the quiet work was where his true value lay. The genius of the operation and its eventual fatal weakness was how the material got out of Moscow. Penkovsky was given a Minox, a miniature camera small enough to hide in a fist. In Moscow, in his apartment and wherever he could get access to classified files through his official work, he photographed documents by the thousand. Military manuals, missile specifications, technical handbooks, the working papers of the Soviet defense establishment. He rolled the exposed film into tiny cassettes, and then those cassettes had to travel from a colonel in Moscow to intelligence officers in the West, across one of the most heavily policed cities on the planet, under the eyes of a counterintelligence service that watched every foreigner. The answer was a courier inside Moscow itself, a woman named Janet Chisholm. She was the wife of Rory Chisholm, an MI6 officer working undercover at the British Embassy. Janet was not a professional officer, but she became the crucial link. A respectable English woman, a diplomat's wife with children, doing the ordinary things that a diplomat's wife with children does. And in the course of those ordinary things, she met Penkovsky. The meetings were masterpieces of tradecraft, and to anyone watching, they would have looked like nothing at all. Penkovsky would encounter Janet Chisholm in a public place, a park on a Moscow boulevard, a shop, a street, and in the space of a few seconds, a brush pass, the film would change hands. In one of the most famous arrangements, Penkovsky approached Janet's small children in a park and gave them a box of sweets, a kindly stranger offering candy to children. And tucked inside the box of sweets were rolls of film carrying photographs of the Soviet Union's most secret military documents. Over a 3-month stretch from the autumn of 1961 into the winter of 1962, Penkovsky met Janet Chisholm something like 11 times, and through those brief encounters passed dozens of rolls of film, hundreds upon hundreds of images. In total, between April of 1961 and August of 1962, Oleg Penkovsky delivered to Western intelligence more than 5,000 photographs of classified Soviet documents. It remains one of the largest hauls of genuine high-grade intelligence ever produced by a single human agent. He was not selling scraps. He was photographing the library. But the method that made the operation possible also planted the seed of its destruction. The KGB's counterintelligence officers watched Western diplomats and their families as a matter of routine, and a diplomat's wife, who kept turning up in the same public places, who had contact with the same Soviet citizen, was exactly the kind of pattern their whole profession was built to notice. Janet Chisholm was, in the end, a known quantity. He is the wife of a man the KGB very likely suspected of being an intelligence officer, and that meant every contact she made carried risk. The thread that ran from Penkovsky to the West ran through a woman the enemy was already inclined to watch. Now hold the whole apparatus in your mind. The colonel, the Minox, the box of sweets, the 5,000 photographs, and arrive at October of 1962, when all of it came due at once. That autumn, American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft brought back photographs of something impossible. The Soviet Union was secretly installing ballistic missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the American coast. It was the most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood eye to eye with nuclear war between them. and President Kennedy and his advisors had to make decisions hour by hour on which the survival of millions depended. And here is where one Soviet colonel's photographs became perhaps the most important intelligence in the history of the Republic. The U-2 images showed missile sites under construction in Cuba, but a photograph from 60,000 feet shows shapes, not certainties. What exactly were these weapons? How far could they reach? How long until they were armed and ready to fire? The answers to those questions would determine everything: how much time Kennedy had, whether he could afford the slow pressure of a blockade or had to strike at once, how close the clock truly was to midnight. The answers were already in American hands because Oleg Penkovsky had photographed the manuals. Among the thousands of documents he had passed to the West were the technical specifications and the operating manuals for exactly the type of Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles now being assembled in Cuba. American analysts comparing the U-2 photographs against Penkovsky's stolen manuals could identify precisely what they were looking at: the missile's range, their capabilities, and the step-by-step sequence and timeline by which such a site became operational. They could, in the most literal sense, count the missiles and read the clock. They knew how many days they had. That knowledge gave Kennedy something beyond price in a crisis: time, and the confidence that comes from certainty. He did not have to act blindly out of fear. He knew the sites were not yet ready. He knew he had room to choose the blockade, to apply pressure, to give Khrushchev a way to retreat without firing a shot. And it all rested, in part, on the work of a single GRU colonel who had photographed the Soviet missile program with a camera the size of a matchbox and slipped the film to a diplomat's wife in a Moscow park. But by the time those photographs were saving the world, the man who took them was already finished. The KGB had closed in. Would say the hunt for Penkovsky was, in its way, the mirror image of every American mole hunt in this series. Except that here, it was the Soviets doing the hunting, and they were very good at it. Their suspicion did not begin with Penkovsky himself. It began, almost certainly, with the surveillance net they kept around Western diplomats and their families, and with Janet Chisholm. The KGB watched her, as they watched all of them, and somewhere in that, watching a pattern emerged: contacts, coincidences, a Soviet citizen who appeared where he should not have. Once their attention turned toward the people Janet Chisholm met, the trail began, slowly, to lead toward a GRU colonel named Penkovsky. Through 1962, the noose tightened. The KGB put Penkovsky under intensive surveillance. They are said to have watched his apartment, even to have gotten inside it, observing the man who held the rank and access to do enormous damage. Penkovsky sensed it. His meetings grew more dangerous, the contacts harder to make safely, the feeling of eyes upon him constant. The operation that had flowed so richly in 1961 was choking off in 1962 as the space around him closed. On the 22nd of October, 1962, the KGB arrested Oleg Penkovsky. The date is one of history's grim coincidences. The 22nd of October, 1962, was the very day that President Kennedy went on television to tell the American people about the missiles in Cuba and to announce the blockade, the day the Cuban Missile Crisis broke into the open. As Kennedy spoke to the world, drawing in part on the intelligence Penkovsky had provided, Penkovsky himself was being taken into the cellars of the KGB. The spy who had helped give the West the knowledge to face down the crisis was arrested at the exact moment the crisis reached its peak. His courier was caught next. The following month, in November of 1962, Greville Wynne, the British businessman, the salesman who had carried the lifeline, was seized while on a trade trip in Budapest and taken to Moscow. The Soviets now had both ends of the chain, the agent and the courier. The Soviet state put Penkovsky and Wynne on public trial in Moscow in May of 1963. It was a show trial, staged for the world, a demonstration of Soviet counterintelligence triumph and a warning to anyone who might dream of following Penkovsky's path. Penkovsky was charged with high treason. The verdict was never in doubt. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. According to the official Soviet announcement, Oleg Penkovsky was executed on the 16th of May, 1963, shot the standard sentence for treason of that magnitude. There have long been darker rumors about how he died, the kind of rumors the Soviet system liked to leave unconfirmed, precisely because the fear they generated was useful. But the official record is a bullet, and a man of 43 who had reached the threshold of becoming a Soviet general dying instead as a condemned traitor in a Moscow prison. Greville Wynne, the courier, was sentenced to 8 years. He served far fewer. In April of 1964, the British government arranged a swap, exchanging Wynne for Gordon Lonsdale, the cover name of a Soviet illegal, Konon Molody, who had been caught running a spy ring in Britain. Wynne went home to England, a broken man in many ways, having spent brutal months in Soviet custody for carrying boxes of sweets across a continent. He lived out the rest of his life as the salesman who had been, for one extraordinary stretch, the most important courier in the world. What's Crocodile counts? It is worth sitting at the end with how completely Penkovsky inverts every other story in this series, because the contrast is the whole point. The Americans in these cases, Walker, Pelton, Ames, Hansen, were trusted insiders who betrayed their country for money. And the tragedy of each is that the system that should have caught them did not look. Penkovsky was a trusted insider too, but he betrayed his country, not chiefly for money, though he took money and rank and the promise of a future in the West, but out of some tangled mix of resentment, ego, and a genuine world-saving conviction that someone had to tell the truth before Khrushchev blundered into Armageddon. And the system that should have caught him, the formidable paranoid Soviet counterintelligence machine, very nearly didn't until the tradecraft of his own side, the overused courier the KGB was always watching, gave him away. There is an institutional failure here too, but it is the West's as much as the East's. Penkovsky's handlers leaned on Janet Chisholm because she worked, because the brush passes were elegant and the film flowed, and they kept leaning on her past the point of safety in a city where the wife of a suspected May 6 officer could never truly be invisible. The very richness of the operation, the 5,000 photographs, the 11 meetings, created the pattern that the KGB was built to detect. The thing that made Penkovsky the most productive agent of the Cold War was also, in the end, the thing that exposed him. He gave too much through too narrow a channel for too long, and the channel was watched. And yet, weigh it against what he bought. For roughly 18 months, a single Soviet colonel handed the West a clearer view inside the Kremlin's war machine than it had ever had or would have again. He helped kill the missile gap panic that might have driven the superpowers toward preemptive war. And in the 13 most dangerous days of the 20th century, the manuals he had photographed let an American president count the missiles in Cuba, read the clock, and choose patience over a first strike. It is not too much to say that the secrets in those boxes of sweets are part of the reason the Cuban Missile Crisis ended in a deal instead of a mushroom cloud. He wanted to be a hero. The Americans gave him the code name almost as a courtesy, the way you humor an agent's vanity. But the code name turned out to be the simple truth. Oleg Penkovsky was a vain, bitter, reckless, frightened man. And he was also, by any honest accounting, one of the few individuals who can be said to have personally helped pull the world back from the brink of nuclear war. For that, he was taken to a cellar in Moscow in the spring of 1963 and shot. He has no grave that anyone visits. The state he betrayed erased him. The states he served could never publicly thank him while it mattered. He counted the Kremlin's missiles for the West, and the West counted them in turn over Cuba. And a generation that never knew his name lived to grow old, in part because a disgraced colonel with a White Army father decided, on a bridge over the Moscow River, that someone had to look and that it would be him.